In the city of New Orleans, in the parish records that survive only in fragments, there is a house on Rue Dauphine that no longer exists, and a case file that was never properly closed. The file begins in 1867, 2 years after the end of the Civil War, when a small team from the newly formed Freedmen's Bureau entered a shuttered residence that had belonged to Armand Vautrin, a notary who had spent 3 decades authenticating the sale, inheritance, and transfer of enslaved people. Vautrin had died the previous winter, and the house had stood closed ever since, its shutters nailed from the inside, its garden overtaken by philodendron and rot. The Bureau's interest was narrow and administrative. They wanted whatever paper might help newly freed adults prove who their parents had been, what property had once belonged to their families, and where their relatives might now be found. Nobody expected to find anything more than ledgers and dust. The Bureau itself was barely a year old that spring, its offices understaffed and its authority resented by much of the city it was meant to serve. Its agents worked out of requisitioned rooms near the old cotton exchange, processing an unmanageable volume of claims from adults who had spent their entire lives enslaved and now needed, for the first time in their lives, paper proof of who they were and who their families had been. The house on Rue Dauphine was, on the surface, a minor entry in a long list of properties to be inventoried that season, notable only because its late owner had been a notary and might therefore have left behind unusually useful documentation. No one on the initial assignment sheet expected the house to occupy more than a week of the Bureau's attention. The order authorizing entry describes the property only as the residence of the late Armand Vautrin, notary, deceased, no known heirs contesting, a phrase that would later strike Mercer, rereading it after everything that followed, as almost comically inadequate. Among the clerks assigned to the house was Celeste Baptiste, a black copyist of 34 years, employed by the Bureau for her rare ability to detect the smallest differences between signatures, wax seals, and grades of paper. Supervisors described her in the surviving personnel notes as meticulous to the point of suspicion, a woman who would hold a document up against the window for a full minute before deciding it was genuine. It was this habit, more than any instinct for the uncanny, that the file credits with unraveling what happened inside that house. On the first afternoon of work, as Celeste set her foot on the final step of the service staircase leading toward the sealed attic, the cry of an infant came down through the ceiling above her. The sound was unmistakable in its rhythm, 3 short bursts followed by a silence long enough to make the household hold its breath, and then a small motion overhead, as if a piece of furniture were being dragged a short distance across the floor. The attic door had not been opened in years. A wax seal placed by the parish notary after Vautrin's death remained undisturbed. Every adult in the house that day, 6 in total, was accounted for. There was no infant registered to the property, no infant among the neighboring households, and no record of a child having lived or died on the premises in the memory of anyone questioned. Elias Mercer, the federal supervisor overseeing the inventory, wrote in his first report that the sound was most likely produced by rats disturbing loose boards, or by a draft moving through a warped section of roof timber. He instructed the clerks to continue their work and made no further note of the matter that day. Sabine Delacroix, a laundress of 58 years who had worked in Vautrin's household for most of her adult life and had been kept on briefly to assist the Bureau's inventory, reacted differently. She was in the second-floor hallway carrying a stack of linens when the cry came through the ceiling. According to Mercer's own account, she let the linens fall to the floor without attempting to catch them, and she would not lift her eyes to the ceiling for the remainder of the afternoon. When asked directly by a junior clerk what she thought the sound was, she gave no answer. She finished her tasks in silence and left the property before dusk, a full hour earlier than her usual departure. What Sabine carried out of that house each evening, in the years before the war, is recorded only indirectly, in the small physical details others noticed without fully understanding their cause. A niece who visited her occasionally during that period recalled decades later that her aunt would not sleep with the shutters open, regardless of the season, and that she kept a single candle burning through the night, long after most households had given up the expense. The niece also remembered that Sabine flinched, visibly, at the sound of a chair scraping against a wooden floor, a reaction so consistent that the family eventually learned, without ever discussing it directly, to lift furniture rather than drag it whenever she was present. None of this was understood at the time as anything more than a private eccentricity, the kind every household absorbs without comment. Only later, once the mechanism's dragging box and its shifted floor panel were known for what they were, did the family recognize the shape of what Sabine had been carrying all along, and by then there was no one left to ask her to explain it further than she already had. That same night, 2 bureau employees who had remained in the house to guard the inventory reported hearing the cry again, in the same pattern of 3 short intervals, followed by the same faint scraping. Neither man climbed the stairs to investigate. One of them, in a statement given the following week, said only that he had convinced himself the sound would stop if he did not acknowledge it. A reasoning he admitted, on reflection, made no particular sense, but which had felt in the moment like the only available course of action. No one climbed the stairs to investigate until morning. When morning came and the wax seal on the attic door was finally broken, the room beyond was found in a state of undisturbed order that struck Celeste, by her own account, as somehow more unsettling than disorder would have been. Dust lay evenly across every surface, thick enough to show that nothing had been moved in years, and yet the room did not have the abandoned, sagging quality of spaces left truly forgotten. The crates of registers were stacked with evident care. The cradle stood centered beneath the single dormer window, as though placed there deliberately for anyone who might one day open the door to see. There was no infant, living or otherwise. What Celeste found was a dust-covered cradle, several crates of what appeared to be parish and civil registers, and fixed to the underside of the topmost stair tread, an intricate wooden mechanism connected by a system of cords to a small bellows and a reed salvaged, it would later be determined, from a broken parlor organ. The weight of a foot on that particular stair compressed the bellows and forced air through the reed, producing a sound close enough to an infant's cry to unsettle anyone who did not already know its source. The dragging noise came from a shallow wooden box set into the floor beneath the cradle, which shifted several inches along a track whenever the mechanism was triggered, opening a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Celeste knelt beside the compartment for some time, according to the junior clerk who assisted her, before reaching inside, as though giving whatever might be within the chance to announce itself first. Nothing did. Inside were dozens of baptismal certificates, inventories, bills of sale, and pages torn from older registers, bound loosely with cord that had begun to rot at the knots. Nothing supernatural had cried out from that attic. Something far more deliberate had been built to sound that way, and it had been built for a purpose that had nothing to do with fright for its own sake. It was an alarm. To understand why Vautrin needed an alarm in his own attic, it is necessary to understand what the 2 decades before the war had made of him. Parish records describe him as a notary of ordinary standing until the 1840s, handling wills, property boundaries, and marriage contracts for the merchant families of the Vieux Carré. Sometime in that decade, according to a fragmented ledger recovered later from the compartment beneath the cradle, his practice began to include a different kind of transaction, one that did not appear in his public account books. Louisiana law required documentation for every sale, inheritance, and transfer of an enslaved person, and Vautrin's talent, it seems, was for making documentation appear where none should have existed. He did not merely authenticate transactions. Over 3 decades, he administered what the recovered papers describe as a private system for the manufacture of identities sold to slaveholders, debt collectors, and men who described themselves discreetly as agents. The earliest entries in the recovered ledgers, dated by the paper's manufacture and by references within the text to events of the period, suggest the practice began modestly, limited to a handful of transactions each year, mostly involving debt claims against men and women whose free status was inconvenient to a creditor with influence enough to challenge it. Word of Vautrin's usefulness in such matters appears to have travelled slowly at first, through the kind of private introductions that left no correspondence behind, and then more quickly, once a small circle of planters and agents came to understand what could reliably be purchased from him. By the 1850s, the ledgers show a marked increase in volume. Coinciding court records elsewhere in the parish confirm, with a period of tightening restrictions on the manumission of enslaved people and rising anxiety among slaveholders over the growing population of free people of color in the city. Vautrin's services, in other words, became most valuable precisely when the line between free and enslaved status was under the greatest public strain, and when a plausible document could settle, in an afternoon, a dispute that might otherwise have required a costly and uncertain appearance before a judge. He appears, from every surviving account, to have kept this second practice entirely separate from his public reputation. Clients who came to him for ordinary business, wills, property surveys, marriage contracts, described him consistently as scrupulous, even pedantic, a man who would not let a comma's placement pass uncorrected. It was precisely this reputation for exactness that made his other work possible. A document bearing Vautrin's seal was, by the testimony of several merchants questioned after the war, considered close to unimpeachable, and it was this trust, cultivated over decades of legitimate precision, that he spent one falsified certificate at a time on the system Celeste would later uncover in his attic. The house on Rue Dauphine, in the years before the war, kept a household routine that neighbors would later describe as unremarkable, even quiet. It was a narrow 2-story building with a service wing at the rear, its courtyard shaded by a single fig tree that several former neighbors independently remembered, as though the tree itself had become, in retrospect, a kind of marker for a place they preferred otherwise not to picture in detail. Vautrin lived alone with a small staff, entertained rarely, and was known in the neighborhood mainly for his habit of walking each evening to the cathedral and back, a rosary visible in his coat pocket, though few ever saw him use it. Merchants who dealt with him described a man of exact habits. He arrived at his office at the same hour every morning, refused to conduct business on feast days, and was known to correct, without being asked, the smallest errors in another notary's paperwork. It was this reputation for precision, more than any personal charm, that made his authentication valuable to men who needed a transaction to withstand scrutiny. Sabine had come to the household as a young woman, already literate, a skill she had acquired, according to her later testimony, from a free woman of color who had once employed her mother before Sabine's own enslavement. It was this literacy, rare and therefore valuable to a man like Vautrin, that determined the shape of the rest of her life. On certain nights, without warning, she would be summoned to the attic and instructed to copy old certificates onto new paper, matching hand, ink, and the particular wear of aged parchment as closely as she could. She learned, she said, to age paper with weak tea and to distress the edges of a page against a stone step until it looked decades older than it was. She would later state, in a deposition taken by Mercer's office, that she performed this work for 15 years and that she understood almost nothing of its purpose until the final years, when the sheer volume of names began to trouble her. In the same deposition, she recalled that Vautrin never raised his voice with her, never once struck her in anger the way other men in his position were known to treat those they held in bondage, and that this restraint, more than any threat, was what kept her compliant for so long. She stated plainly that she did not know, for most of those 15 years, precisely what became of the papers she copied, only that Vautrin collected them himself each morning, and that questions were not welcome. The gatekeeper detail arrives here in what the Bureau's later report calls the trigger of the case, though at the time it seemed only an oddity worth noting in passing. A letter, undated but believed by handwriting analysts to have been written some months before Vautrin's death, was found tucked into the spine of one of the attic ledgers. It was addressed to no one by name, written in a hand that did not match Vautrin's own, and it referred only to a delivery that had gone wrong and a name that could no longer be used because its bearer had died in a parish 30 miles upriver. The letter was the first indication Celeste had that the ledgers in the attic were not simply records of past transactions. They were an active inventory, maintained and updated, of identities still in circulation. For a period after the initial discovery, the household and the Bureau staff alike settled into what the file describes, almost with relief, as a convenient explanation. Mercer's second report suggested that the mechanism was likely an old prank or a security measure installed by Vautrin to warn of intruders, nothing more sinister than a wealthy man's eccentricity. Two of the junior clerks accepted this readily. One wrote in his own notes that a man in Vautrin's position would naturally want warning if someone approached his private papers, and that the resemblance to an infant's cry was probably coincidental, the reed simply producing whatever sound its improvised construction allowed. A second clerk, a young man named Whitfield, newly arrived from Ohio, went further still, suggesting in a memorandum that the whole affair be closed out of the day's log as a matter better suited to a carpenter's report than a federal inventory. For nearly 2 weeks, the inventory proceeded along these lines, the ledgers catalogued as unremarkable business records, the mechanism dismantled and set aside as a curiosity in a crate marked, in Mercer's own hand, household oddity, no further action required. Sabine, for her part, continued to avoid the upper floor whenever her duties allowed, and when questioned about her reaction on the first day, she stated only that the house had always made unpleasant sounds and that she had grown accustomed to ignoring them. She offered this explanation twice, in nearly identical wording each time, a repetition that Celeste would later note in her own private papers as the kind of consistency a person rehearses rather than the kind that comes naturally from memory. At the time, however, no one thought to press her further. The Bureau had dozens of other properties awaiting inventory that season, and a talking bellows in an old notary's attic was, by any ordinary measure, the least urgent matter on anyone's docket. It was during this period of apparent calm that the house began to exert what several witnesses later called its particular weight. The rooms Vautrin had used for entertaining stood shrouded in sheeting, their furniture arranged as though awaiting guests who would never arrive. Damp had crept along the lower walls facing the courtyard, and in the kitchen, an inventory clerk noted, in a private letter to his sister, that Sabine sometimes stood before the cold hearth for minutes at a time without moving, as if listening for something beneath the ordinary sounds of the house settling. The neighborhood around Rue Dauphine had changed considerably since the war. Many of the merchant families who had once done business with Vautrin had scattered or fallen into poverty, and the street itself had taken on the hushed, half-abandoned character common to blocks where an entire economy had vanished within a few years. The days lengthened into a second and then a third week of cataloguing, and the clerks working in the lower rooms began to develop small private rituals of avoidance without ever discussing them openly with one another. No one took the service stair alone after 4 in the afternoon, and the door to the attic, though officially reopened and cleared of its wax seal, was propped shut each evening with a length of iron pipe that had not been there when the bureau first arrived, though no one would say who had placed it. Mercer's own log for this period grows noticeably shorter, its entries reduced to lists of catalogued items with almost no personal observation, a contrast so stark against his earlier, more discursive notes that a later reviewer of the file underlined the change in red ink and wrote only "Compare style, weeks 2 and 3" in the margin. It was into this atmosphere of decline and quiet avoidance that the second half of the investigation began, prompted not by any dramatic incident, but by the ordinary, patient labor Celeste had been assigned to perform from the start, the slow comparison of one page against another, looking for the small inconsistencies that a less careful eye would let pass. The turning point came when Celeste, cataloguing the recovered ledgers page by page, noticed that the same handful of names recurred with unusual frequency across documents supposedly separated by 20 and 30 years. Many of these names belonged, according to older parish baptismal registers she cross-referenced at the cathedral archive, to infants who had died in their first year of life, decades earlier, while still legally the property of families long since dispersed. It struck her as strange that a notary's private ledger would need to reference deceased infants at all, and stranger still that the same names appeared attached in later pages to adults with full physical descriptions, occupations, and histories of ownership. She began to suspect, though she did not yet have proof, that these were not records of the dead at all, but identities assigned after the fact to people very much alive. Before Celeste's methodical comparisons bore their first real fruit, one further incident entered the record, brief and easily dismissed at the time, though it would later be read as the clearest sign that the house's secrets had not been entirely buried with Vautrin. A former neighbor, a retired ship's chandler named Bertrand Fauchereau, who had lived 2 doors down from the Vautrin residence for over 30 years, appeared unannounced at the property one afternoon during the 3rd week of the inventory, asking to see the attic for reasons he would not fully explain. He told Mercer only that he had, as a much younger man, lent Vautrin a set of iron hinges for a piece of furniture the notary was having built, and that he wished to see whether they were still in use. Mercer permitted the visit out of simple courtesy. Fauchereau climbed the service stair without hesitation, apparently untroubled by the mechanism, which had by then been disabled, and stood in the doorway of the attic for what witnesses described as an unusually long time before asking, in a voice one clerk recorded as noticeably unsteady, whether the cradle was still there. When told that it was, he asked to leave without going any further into the room, and he never returned to the property again. Mercer's report notes the visit but draws no conclusion from it. Only Celeste, reviewing the file months later, thought to note in the margin that a set of iron hinges was an odd thing to lend for the construction of a false cry mechanism, and a stranger thing still to come back asking after, 30 years on. Confirmation came from an unexpected source. Among the free people of color who had begun approaching the Bureau's offices that same season, hoping to locate relatives who had disappeared in the years before the war, several described a pattern that Mercer's office had already heard more than once and dismissed as confusion born of grief. A husband, a sister, a cousin who had vanished after being accused of a debt no one could explain, or declared a runaway from a household to which they had never belonged. One woman, identified in the surviving intake ledger only as Mrs. Prudence Alain, testified that her brother had disappeared some 19 years earlier after a constable arrived at their mother's door, insisting the young man was the legal property of a sugar planter neither of them had ever heard of, carrying papers that named him with unsettling specificity after an uncle who had died in infancy 2 decades before either of them was born. In more than one case, the missing relative had reportedly tried, before disappearing entirely from the record, to insist to a magistrate that they had been born free, only to be told that the documents said otherwise and that their own memory must be at fault. Celeste began to see the shape of the system Vautrin had built. He did not simply forge papers to legitimize a sale. He assigned to free-born men and women, kidnapped or held on invented deaths, the identities of enslaved infants who had died young enough to have left almost no physical description behind, and whose deaths were consequently the easiest to overwrite. The adult would receive a new age, a fabricated lineage, and a retroactive history of ownership, stretching back to a birth that had, in fact, ended in a small grave decades before. Celeste cross-checked 17 such names against burial notations in the cathedral's own register over the course of 4 days, working late into the evening by lamp long after the other clerks had gone home. In every one of the 17 cases, the infant named in Vautrin's ledger had a corresponding verifiable burial entry decades earlier. In the hand, she now recognized as belonging to the same deceased priest whose writing appeared throughout the falsified documents. The pattern was not incidental. It was, as she wrote in a note to Mercer, requesting additional time before the inventory could be considered complete, a harvest of the dead, tended for use against the living. A second petitioner, a man named Josiah Renard, who came to the Bureau's office some weeks into the inventory, provided testimony that Mercer's staff would later consider among the most valuable in the entire case, precisely because it had been recorded before anyone at the Bureau understood its significance. Renard stated that his mother had been born free in the parish of Plaquemine, and that she had, throughout his childhood, insisted on a name for herself that differed from the one recorded in every document the family later needed to establish their standing after the war. He had assumed, for most of his life, that his mother's insistence on the other name was simply a private habit, perhaps a girlhood nickname she had never quite let go of. It was only when Celeste showed him, without explaining its full origin, a name recovered from Vautrin's ledgers, attached to an infant recorded as having died in 1831, that Renard recognized the name his mother had spent her whole life trying to reclaim in private, unable to prove in any court that it had ever truly belonged to her. The mechanism in the attic, Celeste now understood, had never been intended to frighten anyone in the way it had frightened the Bureau's staff. It was an alarm built for a very specific and practical purpose. Whenever someone climbed that particular service stair, whether a curious member of the household or, more dangerously, an official come to inspect the premises, the cry gave those working in the attic time to conceal the ledgers in the hidden floor compartment before the door opened. The genius of the device, if it can be called that, lay in its choice of disguise. A watchman posted at the top of the stairs would have drawn questions. A locked door would have invited suspicion of its own. But a strange, unexplained sound, one that unsettled without quite justifying investigation, could persist for years, tolerated as a mere curiosity precisely because no one wanted to look closely enough to explain it. Sabine, questioned again with this new understanding in mind, finally admitted what she had withheld in her first deposition. She had known the mechanism intimately, she said, because the carpenter who built it had been her husband Etienne, a skilled joiner who had constructed furniture and fittings for half the households on the street. He had been sold away from the city some years before the war, after it was discovered that he had kept, without Vautrin's knowledge, a partial copy of one of the falsified ledgers, apparently intending to use it one day to help someone reclaim a stolen name. Sabine had not seen or heard from him since the morning he was taken from their rented room near the ramparts, and she did not know, at the time of her testimony, whether he was alive. She recalled, in a detail she offered without being asked, that Etienne had built the mechanism reluctantly over the course of several weeks, testing the bellows again and again in a shed behind the house until the sound satisfied Vautrin, and that he had told her once, in the quiet of their own room, that he hated the thing more than any piece of work he had ever built, because it meant that whatever labor he put into it, no matter how fine, could only ever serve to keep something else hidden. 3 distinct hands appeared throughout the recovered documents, a detail that troubled Celeste more than almost anything else she found. One was Vautrin's own, angular and economical. The second belonged, according to comparison with church records, to a priest who had died some years earlier, and whose parish had for decades quietly certified baptisms and burials that did not correspond to any actual infant born or buried. The third hand was identified in several marginal notes only by the initials SD, and it was this hand that Sabine, under continued questioning, finally acknowledged as her own. For 15 years, she said, she had copied certificates that she did not fully understand were being used to steal the identities of the living. She insisted, and nothing in the physical evidence contradicted her, that she had never chosen the names that were assigned, and that Vautrin alone decided which deceased infant's identity would be given to which captured adult, based on a private accounting only he kept in full. When Mercer asked her, not unkindly, why she had never attempted to warn any of the people whose names she copied, she answered that she had not known, in most cases, who those people were, only that the names belonged to children long dead, and that a name on a page, however troubling, had seemed to her for many years like the least dangerous part of what she was asked to do. The most unsettling discovery of the entire investigation arrived when Celeste began comparing the falsified names against the lists of missing relatives that freed people had submitted to the Bureau over the preceding months. The system, she came to understand, was not limited to legitimizing sales. Vautrin had also, as a matter of practice, assigned different false surnames to members of the same family, siblings and spouses included, specifically to prevent their testimony from being accepted as proof of relation in any future legal proceeding. In several documented instances, a person who insisted before a magistrate that they had been born free and named a parent or sibling as proof was informed that the names in question belonged, according to the official record, to people who had died years earlier under entirely different circumstances. Rather than question the paperwork, more than one magistrate had simply concluded that the petitioner's memory could not be trusted. What looked from the outside like confusion or a disordered recollection of one's own family was in fact the deliberate product of documents built to contradict one another by design. Celeste found, among the recovered pages, a short accounting in Vautrin's own hand that laid the method out with a plainness she found harder to read than any single case file. He had written that family testimony posed the greatest threat to a transaction of this kind, since a sibling or a spouse could describe details no false document could anticipate: a birthmark, a childhood illness, a private name used only at home. The remedy, as he recorded it, was to separate the family in the paperwork before anyone thought to separate them in fact, so that when 2 people later insisted before a magistrate that they were brother and sister, the record already showed them born decades apart to different mothers in different parishes under different names. No court, he noted, would credit memory over parchment, and memory, unlike parchment, could not be aged, sealed, or filed away in a diocesan archive to lend it the appearance of long-standing. It was while cross-referencing an old petition, filed years before the war under a name she did not recognize, that Celeste found her own signature. The petition concerned a claim of ownership dispute filed by a planter's estate against a woman described as having run from lawful bondage some 11 years earlier, and it bore at the foot of the final page a signature Celeste recognized instantly as her own hand, in a form she had not used since she was a much younger woman first learning to write her name with any confidence. The petition, dated to a year she could not otherwise account for, was accompanied by a certificate stating that a woman named Celeste Baptiste had died in 1849. Celeste had never seen either document before that afternoon, and she had certainly not died in 1849, nor at any point since. Her hands, the file notes with unusual specificity for an official report, were steady as she set the papers down, and she asked to see the Bureau's copy of the parish baptismal index for the years surrounding her own presumed birth. What she found there confirmed what some quiet part of her, perhaps, had suspected since the first day the false cry sounded through the ceiling above her. The name she had carried her entire adult life, the name under which she had been employed, credentialed, and known throughout New Orleans as a woman of unusual skill, belonged to an infant who had died in 1849, her own name, given to her before her capture and sale as a small child, and recorded in a register that had survived only because it had been misfiled among unrelated church business, was Celestine Rochon. She sat with the two documents side by side for a long while before calling anyone else into the room, according to the account of a junior clerk who observed her through the open door and later described her posture as unnaturally still. "The posture," he wrote, "of someone reading a letter they already suspect will confirm the worst." When she finally spoke, it was not to announce what she had found, but to ask quietly whether anyone knew where Sabine had gone for the afternoon. Sabine confirmed the rest without being asked twice. She had been the one to copy the false certificate that replaced Celestine Rochon's name with that of the dead infant decades earlier, on Vautrin's instruction. But she had also, in an act she could not fully explain even to herself, preserved the original register page, rather than destroying it as she had been told, keeping it folded inside a hymnal for years, in the hope that she might one day find a way to return it to whoever the name truly belonged to. She had not known, until that afternoon in the attic, that the woman standing across from her, examining ledgers with the same steady patience Vautrin had once found so useful in a different copyist, was that person. When Celeste asked her why she had kept the page at all, given the risk to herself if it had ever been found, Sabine answered only that a person needed to believe some small part of what they did could still be undone, or the rest of it would not have been bearable to continue. Celeste later wrote, in a private note appended to her own copy of the Bureau's findings, that she finally understood why Vautrin had watched her so closely on the rare occasions their paths crossed when she was young, before her escape from the household where she had then been held. He had known, she believed, that her survival alone represented a quiet danger to a system built on the assumption that its victims would never cross paths with their own erased history. She noted, with a restraint that the rest of her private writing does not always share, that she chose not to dwell on what Vautrin might have done in earlier years had he realized sooner how close that danger had come to his own door. Mercer forwarded the accumulated evidence to federal authorities, expecting, at minimum, a formal inquiry into Vautrin's decades of practice. The response he received instead was resistance, immediate and coordinated. Merchants who had done business with Vautrin, judges who had presided over the cases his falsified documents had shaped, and several respected members of the city's religious institutions all suggested, separately but in remarkably similar language, that the papers recovered from the attic were forgeries produced after the war, intended to embarrass men who could no longer defend their own reputations. One letter, sent to Mercer's superiors by a prominent attorney who had represented several of Vautrin's former clients, went so far as to suggest that the entire discovery had been staged by Bureau employees eager to justify the continued funding of their office, a claim Mercer's own superiors, to their credit, did not pursue, though neither did they move quickly to act on the evidence he had gathered. Before the full inventory of ledgers could be catalogued and transferred to a secure federal office, the house suffered a fire confined to the floor where the documents were being stored. The rest of the building sustained only minor damage. The official inquiry into the fire concluded that a lamp had likely been left burning, though no one among the small number of people with access to the house that week would admit to having entered the upper floor at all. Mercer's own notes, written some months later and never submitted as part of any official report, record his private suspicion that the fire had been set deliberately by someone with enough standing in the city to ensure the inquiry into it would be brief and unconvincing. He named no one, and the file offers no further evidence on the point, though it does note, almost in passing, that the same attorney who had written to dispute the discovery's authenticity was seen dining with the fire inspector twice in the week before the inspector's final report was filed. Celeste managed to save only a single volume from the flames, a bound collection of loose pages she had set aside separately from the main body of ledgers because they seemed, on first inspection, less organized than the rest. It became known afterward among the small circle of people who learned of its existence as the Book of Second Names. Some of the individuals identified within its pages were eventually able to reclaim, at least on paper, the names and family relations that had been taken from them. Many more pages, however, contained only initials, incomplete dates and references to registers that no longer existed anywhere, having been destroyed in the same fire or lost in the years of disorder that followed the war. Sabine lived for several more years after the events at the house on Rue Dauphine, and she died without ever revealing to Celeste or to anyone else who asked who she believed had set the fire, though more than one person who knew her in her final years came away with the impression that she knew a great deal more than she said. The house itself stood empty for over a decade, its reputation in the neighborhood settling into the kind of vague, unspoken unease that attaches itself to buildings people prefer not to discuss directly. Children on the block were told, without much elaboration, to play elsewhere, and the fig tree in the courtyard was eventually cut down by a later owner who complained, according to a single surviving letter, that its roots had begun disturbing the foundation, though he gave no further explanation for why the work was done at night. It was demolished in 1881 to make way for a row of smaller residences, and the mechanism that had once produced the false cry from the attic, along with the cradle it had been built beneath, disappeared sometime during the clearing of the wreckage, never catalogued or recovered by anyone whose account survives. A brief item in a local paper marking the demolition described the property only as an old notary's house, long vacant, with no mention of the events of 1867 at all, as though the entire episode had already, in the space of 14 years, been folded quietly out of the city's memory of itself. Celeste Baptiste, who by then had reclaimed and begun using the name Celestine Rochon in her private correspondence, though she continued, for reasons of practicality she never fully explained, to sign her professional bureau reports under the name the city had always known her by, went on to assist in several further inventories of notarial and parish records across the parish in the years that followed, work she described in a letter to a former colleague as reading the dead more carefully than the living ever bothered to. She kept the Book of Second Names in her own possession until her death, and instructed in her will that it be deposited with a church archive rather than sold or destroyed, in the hope, she wrote, that someone in some later year might have the patience to finish the work she and Sabine had only begun. The most disquieting detail preserved from the entire affair is not the mechanism, nor the fire, nor even the discovery of Celeste's own erased name among the ledgers. It is a single line, written in Vautrin's own hand at the bottom of the last page Celeste managed to save, beneath a list of altered names stretching back further than any single lifetime could account for. He had written that a document did not need to convince the person it was used against. It needed only to survive long enough that no one else would believe them instead. Nothing in the surviving record explains why he chose to write such a line down at all, in his own hand, in a book he otherwise took such care to keep hidden. Perhaps it was pride in a system he believed no one would ever be patient enough to unravel. Perhaps it was something closer to a confession, set down where he alone, for a time, could read it. Either way, the house on Rue Dauphine is gone. Its street renumbered twice since the 1880s, and no marker stands anywhere on the block to indicate what once happened there. What remains is a single volume in a church archive, a scattering of names that were returned to the people who once carried them, and a great many more that were not, and could not be, because the paper that might have proven who they truly were had already, by the time anyone thought to look for it, been reduced to ash on the floor of an attic that no longer exists.